7 women went missing in Tokyo between 1945 and 1946. All of them were young. All of them were alone. All of them had been approached by the same man at a train station. None of them were found alive. When police finally arrested him, they discovered something that stopped the investigation cold. He had not just killed 7 women. He admitted, voluntarily, without being asked, to sexually assaulting approximately 30 others who had survived and never come forward. And before any of this, in China, he had killed a pregnant woman with a blade. The Japanese government had given him a medal for other killings in the same country. His name was Yoshio KODAIRA. The Japanese state decorated him, then convicted him, then freed him early through a government amnesty, then watched him kill again. He came to every court appearance wearing a straw hat with narrow slits cut where his eyes should be. He could see the room. The room could not see him. He was hanged in 1949. His last words were about the weather. This is the full story. Tochigi Prefecture, January 28, 1905. Yoshio KODAIRA was born the 6th of 8 children into a family already coming apart. His father ran a small inn, which sounds stable until you understand the man running it. He was a violent alcoholic, not occasionally difficult, consistently, reliably violent. He drank away the inn's earnings, gambled what he couldn't drink, and when the money was gone, he beat his family. The inn failed. The family lost what little they had. What remained was a household held together by poverty and fear. Every child builds a model of the world from what they see at home. Kodaira's model was this: strength means domination. Violence is a language. Other people exist in relation to what you can take from them. At school, the picture matched. He ranked 21st out of 23 students. Not because he lacked intelligence, his teacher's notes suggest otherwise, but because he had no framework for why engagement mattered. His first-grade report card included a specific notation: not a single day without a fight. His 6th-grade report read, rude and aggressive. And yet, with female classmates, those same teachers described him as gentle, attentive, quiet. 2 entirely different people in one body, each appearing on cue depending on what the situation required. That ability to switch, to become whatever a moment needed, would shape the rest of his life. On his father's side, every one of his father's 5 siblings suffered from documented mental illness. Whether this shaped KODAIRA genetically, environmentally, or through some combination of both, no one could say. What is clear is that he grew up surrounded by dysfunction at every level, in his home, in his bloodline, in the gap between who he was with boys and who he was with girls. He also stuttered from childhood. In a culture that valued composure and silence, this made him a target. Boys mocked him. He fought back physically, which earned him the reputation in school records, but solved nothing underneath. He was isolated, angry, and already capable of hiding it. He was not yet 18. In 1923, KODAIRA enlisted in the Imperial Japanese Navy at age 18 and was stationed at Yokosuka Naval Base, one of the most strategically significant military installations in Japan. He was no longer the stuttering boy from a failed inn. He wore a uniform. He had rank. He had the authority of the empire behind him. During port calls in Australia and across Europe, he regularly paid for sex. His fellow sailors later described him as quiet, unremarkable, the kind of man who blended into any group without leaving an impression. He had learned by then how not to stand out. Then came China. Shandong Province. Japanese forces were stationed there, nominally to protect Japanese citizens during China's internal civil conflict. In May of that year, fighting broke out between Japanese troops and the Chinese Nationalist Army in the city of Jinan. It was officially called an incident. In practice, Japanese forces moved through the city with overwhelming force. Hundreds, possibly thousands, of Chinese soldiers and civilians were killed. The city fell under Japanese occupation. Kodaira was present. During the fighting, he personally bayoneted 6 Chinese soldiers to death. For this, the Japanese government awarded him the Order of the Rising Sun, 8th class, a formal state decoration. He had killed 6 men with a blade and received a medal. But the medal was for the official combat. What Kodaira did away from the formal battlefield was something else entirely. In the Dagu district of Tianjin, he entered civilian homes. He assaulted women. In at least one documented case, one he confirmed himself without prompting, during his 1946 interrogation in Tokyo. He killed a pregnant woman. He brought this up voluntarily. The detectives questioning him about the Tokyo murders had not asked about China. He told them about China anyway. What that says about his psychology, whether it was confession, an assertion of power, or something else, is difficult to categorize. What is not difficult is the fact itself. During that same interrogation, Kodaira made a broader statement that Japanese historians later found significant. He said openly that the Imperial Japanese military had been deliberately provoking conflict in China long before Japan officially entered the war. Most veterans who knew this said nothing for decades. Kodaira said it casually, in the middle of a murder investigation, as though it were common knowledge. He was discharged in 1932 with the rank of sergeant after nearly a decade in the Navy. He returned to Japan carrying everything he had done. The government that had decorated him for killing did not ask what else he had done. No one did. Back in Japan, Kodaira married. It did not last. His wife discovered he had fathered a child with another woman during their marriage. She left. What Kodaira did next was not a moment of blind rage. It was a decision. On July 2, 1932, he went to the home of his wife's family carrying a metal rod. He beat her father to death. 6 other family members were injured, several seriously. He was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 15 years of hard labor. He served 8. In 1940, the Japanese government issued a general amnesty. It was a sweeping policy decision, broad, bureaucratic, and entirely disconnected from the individual histories of the people it released. Yoshio KODAIRA, convicted of murder and serious assault, 8 years into a 15-year sentence, walked out of prison because a government decree said the doors should open. No parole board evaluated his risk. No psychiatrist assessed whether he was likely to reoffend. No one in any official capacity looked at his file and asked whether releasing this specific man was a good idea. The amnesty applied. He left. He found work as a boiler operator at a factory. In 1944, he remarried. Neighbors later described him to investigators as an ordinary, quiet man, unremarkable. But some of those same neighbors mentioned, when pressed, that he had a habit of finding gaps in the walls of public bathhouses and watching women through them. This was known. It was talked about. Nothing was done about it. In December 1941, prior to his second marriage, Kodaira had acquired a 21-year-old woman through Japan's wartime comfort system. He made her pregnant and abandoned her. This was not criminal under the legal structures that governed such arrangements at the time. The country that gave him a medal for killing. The country that freed him through amnesty after murder. The country that looked away when neighbors mentioned what he did at the bathhouses. This was the same country whose most desperate young women would soon be standing on train platforms, waiting for someone to offer them a way out. To understand how Kodaira operated, you need to understand what post-war Tokyo actually felt like from the inside. The formal economy had collapsed. American occupation authorities controlled the major institutions. Food rationing was strict and often insufficient. Hundreds of thousands of people had been displaced. Entire communities scattered by firebombing, by evacuation orders, by the sheer physical destruction of the war. Families had been separated. The social networks that people relied on for safety and opportunity had been torn apart. Young women were in a particularly exposed position. Many had lost fathers, brothers, or husbands in the war. Many had no savings and no property. The legitimate job market was overwhelmed and chaotic. Getting work, real, stable work, required connections, introductions, someone to vouch for you. Without that, you stood on a platform and waited. Kodaira understood this with precision. He presented himself as a labor recruiter. This was a real profession. Middlemen who connected rural employers with urban workers existed throughout Japan. His story was specific and credible. A farmer outside the city, seasonal work, room and board included, decent wages. In the context of 1945 and 1946, Tokyo, this was not a suspicious offer. It was the kind of opportunity that could genuinely change a young woman's situation. He was patient. He was not rushed. He cultivated. In the case of his final victim, he spent nearly 2 months visiting her home, meeting her family, building a relationship across multiple conversations before anything happened. This was not impulsivity. This was deliberate construction. He operated across multiple stations: Shibuya, Ikebukuro, Asakusa, Tokyo Station, Shintochigi, never concentrating in one location long enough to be noticed as a regular presence. He varied his timing. He selected women who were alone. He never approached groups. The attacks took place in wooded areas outside the city, away from any witnesses. Strangulation was his primary method. He took personal items from the bodies, watches, cash, small valuables, consistently across victims. After the 5th murder, the nature of the attacks changed. Court documents record that Kodaira began sexually assaulting the bodies of his victims after death. This escalation is part of the formal legal record of this case. It is stated here plainly because it is part of what happened, and to omit it would be to give an incomplete account. It is important to be clear about something before naming these women. They were not careless. They were not naive in any way that reflects poorly on them. They were young women in an economically devastated country, doing exactly what anyone in their position would do, evaluating the options available and choosing the one that seemed most viable. Kodaira succeeded because he was skilled at appearing viable. The failure was his. The failure was also the society's. Mitsuko Miyazaki was 21 years old. She was the first confirmed victim attacked on May 25, 1945, more than 2 months before Japan's surrender. The war was still ongoing. Kodaira was already killing. Yori Ishii was 30 years old, the oldest of his confirmed victims. She was strangled near Shintochigi Station on June 22, 1945. Her watch and the money she had on her were taken from her body. Mitsuko Nakamura was 22. July 12, 1945, approached at Shibuya Station with the promise of work on a farm. She had no reason not to believe him. She was killed in a wooded area outside the city. Kazuko Kondo was 22. 3 days later, July 15, 1945, at Ikebukuro Station. Kodaira did not pause between victims. Yoshi Matsushita was 21. September 28, 1945. Tokyo Station. Japan had surrendered 6 weeks earlier. The occupation had begun. The war was over. He continued. Hiroko Baba was 19. December 30th, 1945, the last day of the year. She was approached in the Asakusa district and told there was work in a mountain village in Tochigi Prefecture. Tochigi was where Kodaira grew up. He was bringing her, in some sense, to the landscape of his own childhood. Midorikawa Ryuko was 17. She was the youngest confirmed victim. Kodaira first approached her in mid-June 1946. He visited her home. He spoke with her mother. He presented himself as a trustworthy adult with legitimate opportunities. Over nearly 2 months, he made himself a familiar and reliable presence in her life. On August 6, 1946, she went with him. She was 17 years old, and she trusted him because he had spent 2 months ensuring she would. 3 additional women were connected to Kodaira by investigators: 17-year-old Shinokawa Tatsue, 15-year-old Abe Yoshiko, and a young woman of approximately 20 years old whose identity was never established. At trial, Kodaira denied involvement in all 3 cases. The investigations were never formally closed. August 17, 1946. 11 days after Midorikawa Ryuko disappeared, her parents went to the police. They told investigators about the man who had been visiting their home since June, the one who had seemed so ordinary, who had spoken with them, who had a job for their daughter, who had given them no reason for concern. They gave the police his name: Yoshio KODAIRA. On August 20th, 1946, 3 days after the report was filed, he was arrested. The interrogation that followed was, by any measure, unusual. Kodaira was not silent. He did not demand a lawyer or stonewall investigators. He confirmed the Tokyo murders with a methodical consistency that investigators later described as unsettling, not because he was distressed, but because he was not. He provided details. He placed himself at locations. He confirmed timelines. He also volunteered information that investigators had not asked for. He described the assaults in China, events from nearly 2 decades earlier in another country beyond the jurisdiction of any Japanese court. He brought them up himself. He acknowledged approximately 30 surviving victims of sexual assault who had never reported him to any authority. And then, on the 3 disputed murders, he stopped. On those cases, Shinokawa Tatsue, Abe Yoshiko, and the unidentified woman, he was consistent and immovable throughout every session of questioning. He denied them from the first interrogation through the final day of his trial. Whether that was a calculated legal strategy, genuine innocence in those specific cases, or something else, no one has ever been able to determine. On June 18, 1947, the Court of First Instance convicted him of 7 murders. At every appearance, every single one, Kodaira entered the courtroom wearing a straw hat with narrow slits cut across the front. He could see everything in that room. No one in that room could see his eyes. A man who had spent his entire adult life controlling what others could see of him, maintaining that discipline to the last possible moment. On November 16, 1948, the Supreme Court of Japan upheld the death sentence. October 5th, 1949, Miyagi Prison, Sendai. It was a clear autumn morning, still air, the kind of day that arrives in northeastern Japan with a quiet that feels almost deliberate. Yoshio KODAIRA was 44 years old. He had been in custody for 3 years. He walked to the gallows without incident. Before the sentence was carried out, he was given the opportunity to speak. He said, "I am very fortunate to be able to die on such a beautiful and peaceful day." He was hanged. He did not apologize. He said nothing to the families of the 7 confirmed victims. He said nothing to the 30 women he had admitted assaulting. He offered nothing about the 3 disputed cases. He had spent his entire life controlling what he revealed and what he withheld, and he maintained that control through his final breath. A comment about the weather, then silence. The case of Yoshio KODAIRA is not simply the story of a dangerous man operating in a chaotic time. It is the story of how systems create the conditions for people like him to exist and to keep going. The Japanese military decorated him for combat killing and asked no questions about what else he did in China. The Japanese justice system convicted him of murder in 1932 and released him 8 years later through a blanket amnesty that evaluated no individual cases. The social fabric of post-war Tokyo was so shredded by war and poverty that young women had no safe alternative to trusting strangers, and no infrastructure to warn them when those strangers were dangerous. KODAIRA did not operate despite the system. He operated within the gaps the system left open. His first 3 murders took place before Japan even surrendered, in May, June, and July of 1945, while the country was still at war. The chaos that followed the surrender did not create him. It simply gave him more room. In 2007, British author David Peace published Tokyo Year Zero, the first novel in his Tokyo trilogy, built around the investigation of these killings. The book brought international attention to a case that had been largely absent from English-language accounts of post-war Japan. In 1969, a Japanese anthology film called Love and Crime included a segment based directly on KODAIRA's crimes. The exact number of people Yoshio KODAIRA killed across 2 countries, across more than 2 decades, has never been confirmed. The unidentified victim, whose name investigators were never able to establish, remains unidentified to this day. These are the names of the women who were confirmed as his victims. Mitsuko Miyazaki. She was 21 years old. Yori Ishii. She was 30 years old. Mitsuko Nakamura. She was 22 years old. Kazuko Kondo. She was 22 years old. Yoshie Matsushita. She was 21 years old. Hiroko Baba. She was 19 years old. Midori Kawa Ryuko. She was 17 years old. They were not statistics. They were not a pattern. They were people with families, with plans, with every reason to expect a future. They trusted someone who had spent years perfecting the appearance of being trustworthy. Remember their names. Now let's move on to Kiyotaka Katsuta. A firefighter saves a life, then goes home, then kills someone. That is not a metaphor. That is what happened in Japan between 1972 and 1982. During those 10 years, a decorated firefighter in Kyoto responded to emergencies, carried people out of burning buildings, received commendations from his department, and appeared on national television as an example of public service. During those same 10 years, he strangled women, shot a man dead in the street, robbed businesses at gunpoint, and left at least 8 people dead, possibly 22. The police had no idea who they were looking for. They had a case number, Metropolitan Designated Case 113, which in Japan means a threat so serious it receives the equivalent of a national manhunt. They had bodies, they had shell casings, they had robbery reports. They did not have a name. The name was Kiyotaka Katsuta, firefighter, commended public servant, the first man in the history of the Japanese Supreme Court to receive two separate capital verdicts in a single ruling. He was hanged in the year 2000. Before he died, he asked for the blindfold to be removed so he could see his spiritual advisor one last time. And then, while a priest recited an ancient Buddhist sutra, he spoke the names of everyone he had killed, one by one. This is the full story. Kiyotaka Katsuta was born on August 29, 1948, in Kyoto Prefecture. The historical record on his early life is sparse, unusually so for a case of this magnitude. Japanese court records and investigative documents from this era were not widely digitized or translated, and the available public record focuses almost entirely on his crimes rather than his background. What is documented, however, is significant. Before he ever put on a firefighter's uniform, Katsuta already had a criminal record. The details of that prior conviction are not fully preserved in available sources. What is confirmed is that the conviction existed, and that he concealed it when he applied to the Kyoto Fire Department. He passed every background screening. He completed the required examinations. He was accepted into the service without anyone identifying the discrepancy. This was not a minor administrative failure. In Japan, public safety professions require thorough vetting. The fact that Katsuta moved through that process undetected, with a prior conviction already on record, meant that the man who would become one of Japan's most prolific serial killers entered a position of public trust through deliberate deception from his very first day. Alongside his firefighting duties, Katsuta worked part-time as a truck driver. On the surface, this was ordinary. Supplementary income was common, and driving routes gave him a legitimate reason to move between cities and prefectures without arousing suspicion. No one questioned why a firefighter needed to travel. No one tracked his movements between shifts. Within less than 2 years of joining the fire service, Katsuta had been promoted to deputy chief of his station. His colleagues respected him. His superiors trusted him. He was disciplined, reliable, and effective at his job. By every external measure, he was exactly the kind of person a community wants responding to an emergency. He was also, by this point, already planning his first murder. The year is 1972, Kyoto. Japan in the early 1970s was in the middle of its post-war economic miracle. Cities were expanding. Nighttime entertainment districts were booming. Bars, hostess clubs, and late-night venues employed thousands of women across the country. Women who worked long hours, finished their shifts after midnight, and typically carried their earnings in cash. Katsuta understood this economy precisely. He targeted women who worked in these environments. His selection was not random, it was calculated. Women finishing late-night shifts were tired. They were often traveling home alone on foot or by public transit. They had cash. And crucially, in the social context of 1970s Japan, women working in nighttime entertainment occupied a position that made their disappearances less likely to generate immediate, aggressive police investigation. He strangled them, he took their money, he left. His first confirmed victim died in 1972. He killed again in 1973. then again in subsequent years, but never at a pace that would cluster the cases visibly. Months passed between murders, sometimes longer. He returned to the fire station between killings. He drove his truck routes. He collected his commendations. The intervals were not accidental. Katsuta understood, whether consciously or instinctively, that frequency creates patterns, and patterns create investigations. By spacing the killings across years and varying his locations across the Kyoto region, he ensured that each case was treated as a separate incident by separate investigators in separate jurisdictions. In a country with one of the lowest violent crime rates in the developed world, each unsolved murder received serious attention. But serious attention applied to isolated cases is fundamentally different from serious attention applied to a connected series. The police were working hard on individual cases. No one yet understood they were all the same case. Between 1972 and 1980, 7 women died this way. 7 strangulations, 8 years, 0 connections made. During this same period, in the middle of his killing years, Katsuta appeared on Japanese national television, not once, but multiple times, as a model firefighter, as a decorated public servant. He sat in front of cameras, discussed his work, and received the genuine admiration of a viewing public that had no way of knowing what he did when the broadcast ended. The distance between those two realities, the television screen and the bodies, is not something that resolves easily. It is documented fact, and it does not resolve. By 1980, the strangulation killings had stopped. What caused the shift is not documented. Whether Katsuta made a conscious decision to stop, whether something in his circumstances changed, or whether he simply paused, no source confirms. What the record shows is a 2-year gap and then a dramatic escalation in method and visibility. October 27, 1982. Katsuta struck a police officer with a vehicle and stole his service weapon, a new Nambu M60 revolver. In Japan, where civilian ownership of firearms is effectively prohibited by law and criminal acquisition of guns is extraordinarily rare, a stolen police weapon in the hands of a violent offender was not a routine criminal matter. It was a public safety emergency. 4 days later, October 31st, he used the weapon. A man was shot and killed during a robbery attempt. November 1st, he fired again at another individual. That victim survived. November 28th, he robbed a supermarket in Yamashiro and fled with 1.52 million yen. Japanese law enforcement responded at the highest level available. The case was formally designated Metropolitan Designated Case 113, a classification reserved for threats of extreme and sustained public danger. Hundreds of officers were assigned across multiple prefectures. The case received sustained national media coverage. Japan was watching, and the man they were hunting was a 10-year employee of the Kyoto Fire Department with a record of commendations. The irony of Case 113 is sharp. The robberies and shootings of 1982 generated more investigative resources and public attention than 7 murders over 8 years had. The strangulation deaths of women in nighttime entertainment districts had not produced a national manhunt. A stolen police revolver did. January 31st, 1983. Kiyotaka Katsuta was arrested while threatening an individual with a stolen firearm. The arrest was not the product of a breakthrough investigation. There was no moment of forensic insight or intelligence work that identified him. He was caught in the act of another crime on an ordinary street, apprehended by officers who responded to the scene. A decade of killing ended not with detective work, but with a stolen gun and an ordinary call. During the initial interrogation, investigators focused on what they knew: the shootings, the robberies, the stolen weapon. These were the confirmed crimes. These were the charges being built. Then Katsuta began to talk about something else entirely. He described women, locations in Kyoto, years in the 1970s. He began confessing voluntarily, without being asked, to 7 murders that investigators had not connected to him. 7 cases sitting in separate files, in separate precincts, spanning a decade. Katsuta walked investigators through them one by one. The room in which that interrogation happened has never been described publicly in available English or Russian language sources. What happened inside it? A man choosing, without legal compulsion, to hand over 7 unsolved murders is one of the more documented and least explained moments in the history of this case. The confirmed total reached 8 murders. Investigators developed serious suspicion about as many as 22 total killings over the full span of Katsuta's criminal activity. The gap, 14 cases between confirmed and suspected, could not be closed. Insufficient physical evidence, insufficient corroborating testimony, 14 possible victims without justice in files that remain open. Investigators also developed strong suspicion that several of the female victims had been sexually assaulted before their deaths. This, too, could not be proven to the evidentiary standard required for inclusion in the charges. January 17, 1994. The Supreme Court of Japan issued its final ruling in the case of Kiyotaka Katsuta. He received 2 separate death sentences, not a single sentence covering 8 murders. 2 distinct independent capital verdicts, the first covering the 7 strangulation murders committed between 1972 and 1980, the second covering the shooting murder committed on October 31, 1982. This had never happened before in the history of the Japanese Supreme Court. Legal scholars noted the precedent. The dual sentence reflected the court's position that the 2 series of crimes, separated by method, motive, and a 2-year gap, constituted distinct criminal acts deserving distinct punishment. It was a ruling without precedent, and it stood without appeal. Katsuta was transferred to Nagoya Detention House to await execution. During his years on death row, something changed in him, or appeared to. He developed a relationship through correspondence with a woman writing under the pen name Yuko Kurusu, who had been exchanging letters with him for years. He was formally adopted by her mother. He took a new legal name, Kiyotaka Fujiwara. A cross appeared in his death row cell. He engaged with Buddhist practice through his spiritual advisor. The man who had spent 10 years killing under the cover of a hero's uniform now spent his remaining years under a different kind of cover, or, possibly, without any cover at all. Whether the transformation was genuine is not something that can be determined from the outside. What can be determined is what he did on the morning of his execution. Nagoya Detention House, November 30th, 2000. Kiyotaka Katsuta, legally Kiyotaka Fujiwara, was 52 years old. He had spent 17 years on death row. When the time came, he made a single request. He asked the guard to remove the blindfold from his eyes before the procedure began. He said he wanted to see his spiritual advisor one final time, the person who had written to him through the years, prayed with him, and given him a name and a family in the last chapter of his life. The request was granted. A Buddhist priest began to recite the Prajnaparamita Hridaya Sutra, the Heart Sutra, one of the oldest texts in Japanese Buddhism. Its subject is impermanence, the dissolution of the self, the emptiness that underlies all form. While the priest read, Katsuta spoke. He named his victims, each one, in the order he remembered them, the names of people he had strangled in dark streets in Kyoto in the 1970s, the name of the man he had shot in 1982, one by one, while the sutra continued around him. When he had finished, he said, "I am sincerely sorry." The blindfold was placed back over his eyes. He walked to the gallows without resistance. He was hanged. This was not the ending of Yoshio KODAIRA, a comment about the weather and zero acknowledgement of anyone he had harmed. Katsuta named them. Whether that changes anything for the families of his victims is not for anyone outside those families to answer. The case of Kiyotaka Katsuta does not fit the standard narrative that surrounds serial killers. He was not a social isolate. He was not unemployed or drifting. He was not someone whose neighbors described as strange or concerning. He was a decorated public servant with a stable career, professional respect, and national media appearances. He killed 7 women across 8 years without detection, not because the police were incompetent, but because nothing about his visible life suggested looking at him. The questions his case leaves behind are structural ones. How does a man with a prior conviction pass the vetting process for a public safety role? The answer is that the system relied on self-disclosure and did not independently verify. Katsuta did not disclose. The gap in the system was exactly the width of a person willing to lie about it. How do 7 murders go unconnected across 8 years? The answer is jurisdictional fragmentation and the absence of centralized case linkage systems that would later become standard in Japanese law enforcement after this and other cases exposed the gap. Why did the 1982 shootings generate a national manhunt while the 1970s strangulations had not? That question does not have a comfortable answer. The victims of the strangulations were women working in nighttime entertainment. The victim of the shooting was a man on a street. The investigative resources deployed were not equivalent. They were not close to equivalent. In 1984, a Japanese film titled Renzoku Satsujinki, Reiketsu, Serial Killer, Cold Blood, was released, directly based on his crimes. The fictional killer was named Kiyoshi Tatsuta, close enough to be unmistakable, different enough to avoid legal action. The exact number of people Kiyotaka Katsuta killed has never been confirmed. 8 is the number the court established. 22 is the number investigators suspected. The truth is somewhere in a range between those 2 numbers, and the families of the 14 unresolved cases have lived inside that range for decades. He named his victims before he died. That list was not preserved in any public document available to researchers. We know he named them. We do not have the names he said. A man shot dead on October 31st, 1982. His name is in the court record. 7 women killed between 1972 and 1980. Their names were spoken aloud in a detention house in Nagoya on November 30th, 2000, by the man who killed them, while a priest recited a sutra about impermanence. No recording exists. No transcript was published. They deserved more than that. They deserved to be known by name in every account of this case. The failure to preserve their identities in the public record is not a minor administrative gap. It is a continuation of the same invisibility that made them easier to target in the first place.